No wake, no distress call, no survivors. Only scattered wreckage drifting across the North Atlantic and a life raft twisted in ways that trained naval engineers declared impossible to explain. The MS München left Bremerhaven in December of 1978 with 28 men aboard. She was considered one of the most structurally sound container ships operating on the Atlantic route, built for exactly this kind of crossing. What force silenced 28 men without leaving a single trace behind? The port of Bremerhaven, in December, operated with the mechanical indifference of a place that had been loading ships for centuries. Salt air, diesel exhaust, the yellow arms of container cranes moving steel boxes onto the München's deck in precise, unhurried sequences. Dieter Vogel, the cargo supervisor assigned to the departure, walked the manifest one final time before clearance. 141 containers. All weights within regulation, all lashings checked and signed. The MS München had been built in 1972 at a West German shipyard. 20,000 tons of steel, 161 meters from bow to stern. Diesel-powered, fitted with modern navigation instruments, VHF radio, and telegraph equipment. By the standards of her era, she was not a ship that was supposed to disappear. Captain Werner Böhm had commanded her for 3 years. He had crossed the North Atlantic aboard that hull more times than he recorded in any single logbook. The Hapag-Lloyd shipping line operated some of the most heavily trafficked routes in the North Atlantic. The München was among their newer vessels, part of a generation of container ships built in the early 1970s to handle the growing volume of transatlantic freight. Her hull had been designed to absorb the punishment of winter crossings. Her structural frames were rated beyond the standard requirements for Atlantic service. When she left Bremerhaven that December morning, she carried the confidence of a vessel that had proven herself on the route before. On the morning of December 12th, the München cleared Bremerhaven and set course for Savannah, Georgia. The route was standard for Hapag-Lloyd container ships operating that season. North Atlantic winter crossings always carried the expectation of heavy weather, but the München had been designed with that expectation built into every weld and bulkhead. First Officer Klaus Hartmann logged the initial conditions: unsettled skies, heavy swell, southwest winds. Nothing that distinguished this departure from 100 others. For the first days of the crossing, the München's radio operator, Heinrich Schreiber, transmitted at regular intervals. Position reports, speed, weather observations. The transmissions came through clearly, logged by coastal stations and relayed through the standard maritime communication network of the period. There was nothing in those early messages that suggested anything other than a routine winter passage across difficult water. Then the North Atlantic showed what it had been building. A storm system of unusual intensity had been developing across the region where the München was sailing. Meteorological records from that period documented winds exceeding 80 kilometers per hour and wave heights estimated between 10 and 15 meters. Severe, but within the range that a vessel of the München's class was certified to withstand. That was what the engineering tables said. That was what Hapag-Lloyd's operational guidelines assumed. On the night of December 12th, a fragmented transmission reached the coastal radio station. The words came through, broken, partially swallowed by static. What the operators managed to capture and log was enough to trigger emergency protocols. The ship was in serious difficulty. An approximate position was recorded. A response was transmitted. No confirmation came back. The silence that followed was not gradual. It arrived all at once. In the hours after that transmission, radio operators on shore attempted contact with the München on multiple frequencies. The channel remained empty. Nearby vessels were contacted and asked to verify the area. No visual sightings. No emergency flares on the horizon. No illuminated life raft visible from the surface. The München, 28 men and more than 20,000 tons of steel, had vanished from the radio spectrum as though she had never been there. On December 13th, Hapag-Lloyd confirmed the communication failure to West German maritime authorities. A search operation was launched. Aircraft from West Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States began flying grid patterns over the München's last known quadrant. Nearby merchant vessels were diverted to assist. The North Atlantic that winter did not cooperate. The storm was still running, cutting visibility and making any systematic surface search brutally difficult. The first wreckage was found days later. Timber fragments, a life jacket stenciled with the ship's name. And then the discovery that changed the register of the entire investigation. One of the München's enclosed life rafts was recovered, floating free. Rescue worker Rudolf Steiner was among the first to examine the raft up close. He described what he saw to investigators later. The structure had been deformed in a manner he had never encountered on any piece of emergency equipment. The metal bracket assembly that secured the raft to the ship's side, a fitting engineered to absorb extreme loads, had been bent inward, not outward, as though the force that struck it had come from above, or from a direction that no conventional wave could produce. Franz Meissner, the Hapag-Lloyd technical inspector assigned to examine the recovered debris, was quiet for a long moment when he saw the photographs. That pattern of deformation did not appear in any structural damage manual he knew. The raft had been mounted more than 20 meters above the waterline. For it to have been struck in that way, a wave would have needed to reach that height with enough residual force to bend steel. The oceanographic models of 1978 did not predict that as possible in the North Atlantic, but the wreckage did not lie. The preliminary report submitted to West German maritime authorities carried a notation that no engineer expected to have to write. The damage observed was inconsistent with storm conditions within known parameters. The cause of the sinking remained, technically, without adequate explanation. 28 men, no bodies, and a life raft bent in a way that the science of that moment had no name for. Franz Meissner's report circulated through Hapag-Lloyd's Hamburg offices in the weeks following the disappearance. Each engineer who read it arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. The documented damage to the München's life raft could not be attributed to any oceanic condition on record in German or international maritime archives. The metal structure had been subjected to a load that exceeded every reasonable estimate for that region of the Atlantic. Otto Brandt, the München's chief engineer, had been known among Hapag-Lloyd colleagues as a methodical man. 20 years at sea across 6 different vessels. Those who worked with him could not imagine him ignoring any sign of mechanical failure aboard. If the engines had shown strain, if any system had begun to degrade, Brandt would have logged it and reported it. And yet the last known communications from the München contained no mention of propulsion problems. The ship had been moving when contact was lost. That eliminated one of the simplest available explanations, that the München had lost power during the storm and been destroyed by successive waves while stationary. A vessel without propulsion, beam on to 10-meter seas, was vulnerable in ways that a ship under power was not. But the München had been moving. Whatever destroyed her had been fast enough to prevent any organized distress transmission. The fragmented transmission from the night of December 12th was analyzed repeatedly. Radio technicians attempted to reconstruct the words lost in static. What had been captured clearly was minimal, a position reference and a word interpreted by operators as indicating a serious emergency aboard. Everything else was gone. No description of the threat. No request for instructions, as though whoever was transmitting knew there was no time for anything beyond those few words. Heinrich Schreiber had been a professional radio operator for more than a decade, a man trained to remain composed during emergencies and transmit structured information under extreme pressure. The fact that his last known transmission was fragmented and incomplete said something about the speed with which conditions aboard had deteriorated. Investigators calculated the interval between the last routine transmission and the emergency message. It was less than 1 hour. In under 60 minutes, a modern ship had moved from normal operation to complete silence. That was not consistent with a progressive sinking caused by water ingress or gradual mechanical failure. Those processes took hours. Whatever happened to the München had happened fast. The search operation was formally closed weeks later, with no survivors recovered and the hull never located. The North Atlantic had taken the München's 28 men with an efficiency that investigators could not explain through standard maritime accident frameworks. Wrecks left traces, bodies, equipment, oil slicks, containers adrift. The München had left only scattered fragments and a raft with impossible damage. At Hapag-Lloyd's Hamburg headquarters, the München file grew thicker with technical reports, statements from rescue personnel, and oceanographic analyses. Each document arrived carrying the same implicit footnote: cause of sinking undetermined. For a shipping company operating dozens of vessels on the Atlantic, that conclusion was not merely unsatisfying, it was unsettling. Because if the München had been destroyed by something outside the predictive models, other ships in the same fleet were sailing the same routes, and no one knew with certainty what had been waiting for the München on that December night. Hapag-Lloyd's internal review extended to the München's sister vessels. Engineers examined the structural specifications of other container ships in the same class, looking for any design weakness that might have contributed to a catastrophic loss under extreme wave loading. They found nothing that distinguished the München from the ships still in service. The hull had met every applicable standard. The fittings had been installed correctly. The maintenance records showed no deferred repairs. Whatever had happened to the München had not happened because she was defective. That finding made the inquiry harder, not easier. A defective ship offered a path to resolution: identify the flaw, issue a retrofit requirement, close the file with an engineering recommendation. A ship that met every standard and disappeared anyway offered nothing to close. It offered only the bracket, bent in its impossible direction, sitting in a Hamburg storage facility with no category to be filed under. Wreckage continued to surface sporadically, carried by North Atlantic currents. Each new piece was catalogued, photographed, and forwarded for analysis. None of it brought a new answer. But there was one detail that investigators kept returning to, regardless of which aspect of the case they were examining. The life raft had been secured more than 20 meters above the waterline. To strike it, a wave would have needed to exceed that height with structural force. In the oceanic models of 1978, waves with those characteristics in the North Atlantic were considered mathematically improbable to the point of being excluded from naval engineering calculations. The problem was that the raft was bent inward, not outward, as a conventional wave impact would produce. The angle of the deformation suggested a force that had arrived from below and above simultaneously, or from a direction that no engineer could reproduce in any testing environment using the known conditions of that region. Werner Böhm had sailed the North Atlantic for decades. He knew December storms better than most captains in the Hapag-Lloyd fleet. If something was in the ocean that night that he did not recognize, there had been no time left to record what it was. The inquiry into the München's loss was formally conducted by West German maritime authorities in the months following the disappearance. Investigators interviewed Hapag-Lloyd operations personnel, reviewed the ship's maintenance records, and examined every piece of recovered wreckage. The process was methodical, the documentation was thorough, and the conclusion, when it finally came, was the kind that bureaucracies produce when the evidence refuses to cooperate with any available category: cause of loss undetermined. That phrase carried significant weight in maritime law. It meant no liability could be formally assigned. No operational failure could be cited. No design flaw could be attributed. For the families of the 28 men aboard, that determination was not an answer. It was the permanent absence of one. Franz Meissner had spent 30 years working with maritime insurance and technical assessment before the München case landed on his desk. He had examined wreckage from collisions, fires, groundings, and structural failures. He understood how steel behaved under load, how hulls failed under stress, how emergency equipment absorbed impact. What he had seen in the photographs of the München's life raft bracket did not match any failure mode in his experience. The bracket itself was the detail that kept surfacing in every technical discussion. It was a forged steel fitting, rated to absorb the lateral force of a heavily loaded life raft swinging on a pitching deck in heavy weather. The rating was generous, built with a substantial safety margin. For that fitting to have been bent inward, toward the ship's hull rather than away from it, the force applied would have needed to come from the ocean side and push directly against the bracket's mechanical resistance from outside in. A wave striking the raft from the sea would have pushed outward, away from the hull. The deformation pointed in the opposite direction. Meissner wrote in his private notes, never formally submitted to the inquiry, that the only mechanism he could imagine producing that specific deformation was a column of water moving vertically, from below the raft's mounting position upward, with enough velocity to strike the underside of the bracket assembly and bend it inward against the hull. In 1978, the oceanic science to explain such a mechanism did not yet have a widely accepted name. The term rogue wave existed in sailor accounts going back centuries. Men who had served long careers at sea described, occasionally and reluctantly, encounters with single waves of extraordinary height and steepness that bore no relationship to the surrounding sea state. These accounts were consistent across different oceans, different ship types, and different eras. They described a wall of water that appeared without warning, often in conditions that did not otherwise justify such an event, and that struck with a force entirely disproportionate to what the prevailing weather would have predicted. Maritime science in 1978 treated those accounts with measured skepticism. The mathematical models used to predict wave behavior in storm systems did not produce waves of the height and steepness that sailors described. The models were based on linear assumptions about how wave energy accumulated and dispersed across open water. Within those assumptions, a wave exceeding 25 meters in the North Atlantic was statistically remote to the point of irrelevance for engineering purposes. The München case did not change that official position immediately, but it added weight to a file that was already accumulating evidence that the models were missing something. Reports from other vessels, collected over years by maritime research institutions, described encounters with waves that did not conform to predicted sea states. Oil platforms in the North Sea had recorded structural impacts that could not be reconciled with the wave heights the surrounding conditions were supposed to generate. Each incident was handled individually, attributed to instrument error or exceptional local conditions, and filed without reference to the others. What no single institution had done by the time the München disappeared was compile those reports into a coherent pattern. They existed in separate filing systems, in different countries, under different classification schemes. The München's loss joined that dispersed archive as one more entry under undetermined cause. Klaus Hartmann's last logged entry, reconstructed from partial records, noted nothing unusual in the ship's structural condition before the storm intensified. The München was riding heavy weather as designed. Her ballast was correctly distributed, her cargo was secured. There was no reason in that log entry to expect what followed. That gap between a ship operating normally under difficult but manageable conditions and a ship that produced a single fragmented radio transmission, and then nothing, was the space that the official inquiry could not fill. Investigators calculated possible scenarios. Rapid flooding through a hull breach caused by wave impact, catastrophic container shift causing sudden loss of stability, structural failure at a critical frame location. Each scenario had some evidentiary support. Each had elements that the recovered wreckage contradicted. The container shift scenario was examined with particular care. If the München's deck cargo had broken free in extreme sea conditions and shifted to one side, the resulting list could have become unrecoverable within minutes. That kind of loss was fast. It could silence a ship before a full distress call was possible. But the lashing records from Bremerhaven were intact and showed no irregularity. Dieter Vogel's manifest documented every container position and securing method. The München's cargo had left port correctly stowed. None of the scenarios fully explained the life raft bracket. That fitting remained the single piece of physical evidence that the inquiry could not accommodate within any of its proposed explanations. It sat in the report as an unresolved footnote, acknowledged and then moved past. The bracket's deformation was noted, its anomalous character was recorded, and the inquiry proceeded to its conclusion without resolving what it meant. Outside the formal inquiry, in conversations among maritime engineers and oceanographers in the years that followed, the München case became a reference point for a different kind of discussion, one that was less about what went wrong aboard a specific ship and more about what the existing models of ocean behavior were failing to account for. That discussion would take 2 more decades and a satellite measurement campaign to reach any kind of institutional resolution. In December of 1978, Werner Böhm's ship was gone, and no one in any official capacity could say with precision what had taken it. The facts of the München case, stripped of speculation, occupy a narrow and unambiguous space. The ship departed Bremerhaven on December 12, 1978, with 28 crew members and 141 containers. She entered a severe North Atlantic storm sometime that night. A single fragmented radio transmission was received, indicating serious difficulty. No further contact was established. A multinational search recovered scattered wreckage over the following days, including one lifer raft with structural damage inconsistent with standard storm conditions. No bodies were recovered. The hull was never located. The official cause of loss was recorded as undetermined. That is the complete documented record. Everything beyond it is inference. But the inference, assembled carefully from the physical evidence and the oceanographic science that developed in the decades following the loss, points toward a conclusion that is more specific than the official record acknowledged. The most consistent explanation for what happened to the MS München on the night of December 12th is that the ship was struck by a rogue wave, a single anomalous wall of water of sufficient height and force to overwhelm her structural integrity before any organized response was possible. The evidence that supports this conclusion is concentrated in the lifer raft bracket. That fitting was mounted more than 20 meters above the waterline. Its inward deformation indicates a force applied from the ocean side pushing against the bracket's mechanical resistance. A force profile consistent with the leading face of an extremely steep wave striking the ship's upper structure from the sea. The speed of the event, inferred from the absence of any sustained distress transmission, is consistent with the impact of a rogue wave hitting a vessel broadside or at an angle that allowed no recovery time. A ship struck in that way, with sufficient force across her upper hull and superstructure, could lose stability and founder in minutes. The under 60-minute window between the last routine transmission and the fragmented emergency call narrows the probable mechanism to something that overwhelmed the ship before her crew could organize a response. In 1978, that explanation was not available in any institutionally accepted form. Rogue waves were sailor testimony, not engineering data. The models said such waves were too rare to design against. The München's loss could not be officially attributed to a phenomenon that maritime science had not yet formally recognized. That changed in February of 1995, when the Draupner oil platform in the North Sea recorded a single wave measuring 25.5 meters during a storm where the surrounding sea state predicted a maximum wave height of 12 meters. For the first time, a rogue wave was captured by instrumentation and entered the scientific record as a measured physical event rather than an anecdotal report. The data confirmed what sailors had been describing for centuries. The ocean was capable of producing isolated waves of extraordinary height and steepness that existing linear models could not predict. The European Space Agency's MaxWave project, conducted in the early 2000s, used satellite radar data to survey the world's oceans over a 3-week period. The results documented 10 waves exceeding 25 meters during that window alone. The North Atlantic, the München's crossing route, contained several of them. The models that had declared such waves statistically irrelevant were replaced by nonlinear frameworks that acknowledged rogue waves as a genuine and recurring feature of open ocean storm systems. None of that research brought any formal revision to the München inquiry. The case remained filed under undetermined cause. No official body reopened the investigation in light of the new oceanographic data. The connection between the München's loss and the emerging science of rogue waves was made by researchers and maritime historians, not by any government agency or shipping authority. Hapag-Lloyd absorbed the loss as an unresolved liability. The families of the 28 men received no revised explanation from any official source. The wider shipping industry did eventually respond to the accumulating evidence. Hull design standards for large vessels were reviewed and, in some categories, strengthened to account for wave loads that the previous engineering tables had not included. International maritime regulations were updated to reflect a more demanding set of structural requirements for vessels operating in high-sea environments. Those changes were implemented without formal reference to the cases that had made them necessary. The München was not cited. The men aboard her were not named. Werner Böhm, Klaus Hartmann, Heinrich Schreiber, Otto Brandt, Rudolf Steiner, and 23 others whose names appear in Hapag-Lloyd's crew manifest, and nowhere in the revised safety frameworks their disappearance helped make necessary. The engineering standards that protect the ships sailing those same North Atlantic routes today were shaped, in part, by what happened to the München. The process by which that knowledge moved from a bent lifer aft bracket to a revision of international maritime regulations did not require anyone to acknowledge the connection out loud. The München's file, in the official German Maritime Archive, carries the same notation it carried when it was closed in 1979. Cause of loss: undetermined. The ocean that took her has been mapped more carefully since then. The waves she encountered have been given a name and a mathematical framework. The gap between what the models predicted and what the wreckage showed has been narrowed by decades of research that her disappearance quietly contributed to. What it has not been given is an accounting. Not for the 28 men. Not for the families who were told that the cause was undetermined and left to carry that word for the rest of their lives. Not for the institutional decision to close the file without revisiting it when the science finally caught up to what the evidence had been showing all along. The North Atlantic still runs the same routes. The winter storms still build the same way. And the München's question was never about the ocean. It was about who decides which dangers are worth naming before the ships sail.